Yes. What? Yes, on the divine service. Can you give the actual page? I don't have it there.
55 and 57.
There's just only a couple of points, I think, for the whole.
I'm summarising from 55 to 57. I think that's somewhere there. Now, just a more general thing, if any of you want electronically, I'm not going to print it out, but if you want copies of these overheads that I'm using, I'll put them in a file and you can access it then. File with and then sub-files in it. Or
Spend half an hour drawing that diagram.
that diagram doesn't, yes, okay, yes. Righto. How many of you would be interested in a file of the OHP stuff, which is the summary of the summary? Okay, well I can forward it to you. Now, I've been speaking about the public sacrifices, the public offerings that the priests bring on behalf of the nations to God every morning, every evening. Now, you need to distinguish these quite clearly from the family offerings, the personal offerings that the Israelites bring 2 or 3 times a year, probably at the most, although they could bring at any time. There's no restrictions on when they offer them, but they bring them occasionally to the Lord. So if you wanted to distinguish between them, say there's a difference between the divine service and other occasional services in our tradition. Right? This is like our occasional services. And a lot of people get things all muddled up and can't make sense of it because they run those two things together. Keep them separate. Every morning, every evening, there is a burnt offering and a grain offering, cereal offering, that's presented on behalf of the nation to the Lord. Now, the amount of that increases for special occasions. And the great festivals, it increases quite considerably. As well as that, on the festivals, there's a public sin offering, for the whole congregation that's assembling in God's presence every day. Now, that's the public offerings. I want to now focus on the personal offerings, the family offerings. And the obligation is this. God gave his land on loan to his people. It's his land. It's not their land, it's his land. Now, if you borrow land from somebody, in a sense, if you're a tenant on somebody's land, what do?
Look after and pay rent.
You pay rent. You pay rent for it. Now, the offerings that the people bring are taken from the produce of the land, and they're offered to God as, if you like, their rent for the land. Their acknowledgement that God is the giver of these gifts, and he's the owner of the land. I grew up in a rural community, and it was very common for to have share, for large property owners to have share farmers. You know the way it works. You work the land, and then as part of the deal is that you don't pay for it, you don't rent the land, but you give the boss a certain percentage of the whole produce. Now, what is it that the Israelites bring as their offerings to the Lord? There's 2 classes. First of all, there's the first things, and then there are tithes, and then there are other possibilities. The most important offerings that they bring and that they're obligated to bring are the first things. And they consist of 2 kinds. There's the firstborn male animals. Now, if you get a ewe producing, the first male lamb that she produces belongs to God. If you have a she-goat producing a male kid, that belongs to God. A cow producing a calf, male calf, that belongs to God. Now, Now, can you see? That's the expendable part, because you know, if any of you know anything about farming, looking at sheep, what's most of your stock going to be? Which sex? You're not going to have, when it comes to being born, you get roughly an equal number of male and female animals. But what you need for any one flock of sheep, how
Females.
you need basically females. They are your breeding stock. All you need is 1 or 2 rams. The rest are expendable. Therefore, what do you do? What does a farmer do to male? Castrates them and sells them. That's your lamb. That's what you buy in the shop when you buy lamb. You don't need them. You keep the female ones until they can't breed anymore, and then you kill them off. Okay? But the males you get rid of pretty early, otherwise they cause too much trouble. So firstborn male animals belong to God. And also the first fruits of your agricultural produce, the first fruits of your grain, the first fruits of your olive oil, the first fruits of your wine. And there's 2 different kinds of grain which were common in Israel, was either barley, which was the commonest grain, and they're more precious than barley, more valuable than barley is wheat. So you bring the first produce, whether it's animals or food stuff, and you offer it to God. Yes?
So that's say you've got a farmer and a carpenter.
Yes.
It's a heavier burden on the farmer than it is on the carpenter.
Okay. The carpenter doesn't have to bring anything.
Okay.
Yeah. It only applies if you're living in the land of Israel. So any Israelite living in foreign territory was not obligated to bring this. There were some other offerings that he could bring, which is the temple shekel, and more generally, you presented a tithe of not just your produce, but a tithe of everything you have to God. And that gets very complicated. I won't go into the complications of that. But most of the tithe goes to the Levites and supports, therefore, if you like, the clergy of Israel. Then you, as well as that, you can bring any other free will or thank offering, just because. Now, can you see what the problem's going to be? And Christopher, you identified it. If you're not a farmer, if you're not a landowner, what's the problem when you come up to the temple? To the tabernacle, temple, holy place. You haven't got anything to bring to God. This is not a money economy. It's bartering, basically. It's an agricultural subsistence bartering economy. Now, by the time of Jesus, you had the conversion of stuff into money. And remember the stuff Jesus cleaning out the money changers? You came with cash and then you bought animals to present. That way, you bought food stuff and animals to present your offerings, equivalents. Now, however, it was evened out. If you like, this is a compulsory saving system. You set aside a certain amount of your food to be used to feast on once a year, or twice a year, or 3 times a year. Now, can you see, if you're a wealthy farmer, what's going to be the problem?
You're going to have too much.
You're going to have far too much for you and your family to eat. Do you know what the God's law prescribes? And you get it very clearly enunciated in the book of Deuteronomy.
You invite people to join you in the feast.
Yes. And which people would you invite? Your wealthy friends? The poor, the needy, the orphans, the widows, the people... and not only that, but then there's also the aliens, who are the landless people, who are the tradesmen. The people who haven't got anything to bring, you invite them. And you invite, secondly, you invite the Levites, the pastor and his family, to go along with, because he's got no land. He's got nothing to bring to God. So he comes as your guest. Now, it has the added benefit This is a kind of a tribal society that by inviting your people in your local community, you become a big person and you put people under obligation to you. The laws, however, that if you read very carefully in the Old Testament, are such that you have to avoid trying to use this to manipulate people and to put them under obligation. The idea is God has blessed you and given you so much, therefore what do? You bless others by handing on what you don't need to others. And that includes the tithes. Most of the tithes go to either the clergy or poor people. For
There's no distinction.
the same thing. But not all poor people are clergy. Not all people. Okay, that's the big picture. Now, one other thing I'd like to emphasise is that the whole point of coming to meet with God is not for you to give all this stuff to God, but the paradox is that you bring this stuff to God, and what does God do? He gives it back to you. You bring the blessings you've received from God to acknowledge God as the giver of blessing, and what does God do? He takes blessed food stuff and he gives it back to you as holy food stuff. So all the point of this is to have a holy meal. Okay, you'll miss the point of this unless you see that that's the focal point, is for you to be able to eat and drink and rejoice in the presence of the Lord. That's the language of Deuteronomy. Lastly, you need to know, and I've mentioned this before, but I'd like to emphasise this again, that until modern times, people ate meat only rarely, occasionally, unless they happened to be, sheep farmers. Then you'd eat it more commonly, graziers out in the Mallee, the Mallee of Israel. But normal people had only a very small amount of livestock, very, very precious. You don't eat meat. It's just too valuable. The only time you eat meat is at the great festivals. Which people, however, would eat meat every day? Those graziers could eat it every day because that's their livelihood. Forget about the priests because they have it also. But in a secular term, secularly speaking, who would be able to eat meat every day? The rich, and particularly kings. So kings eat meat every day. Now, if God provides meat for his priests every day, what's he treating them as if they are? Royalty. He's giving them the royal treatment. They aren't just his lackeys, his slaves, but they are members of his royal family. He gives them the royal treatment. And 3 times a year, if you like, God gives every Israelite what kind of treatment? The royal treatment. They eat and drink from the table of the heavenly King. God is the host. God prepares a royal banquet for his people 3 times a year. And he arranges it in such a way that whether you're rich or poor, everybody will be able to eat from that table. And they'll be able to rejoice, feast in God's presence. Any questions on that big picture stuff? Yes? The daily sacrifice is, and that differs from various various periods of Jewish history. From the period in the up to the kingship, it was provided by the tax, the temple shekel, which you'll find mentioned in Exodus chapter 30. So there's a certain amount of money that's given, and then the priest then would purchase the animals that are needed. As it were needed, would purchase the flour, the olive oil, the wine that was needed. So there was a offering, a sanctuary tax. The money of atonement, the money that was used so that atonement could be done. Now, when you had, that's the first period leading up to the time of the temple. Now, Solomon brought about a new innovation here. He not only established the temple in Jerusalem, he was the patron of the temple. Therefore, who looked after the temple buildings, who helped to provide all the stuff that was needed for the daily sacrifices? Can you work out? The king did. So it came out of public purse, the king's purse. So the king provided that on behalf of the people. It was his service to the people and also to God. Thirdly, can you work out what the problem was when Ezra and Nehemiah and the people came back from exile in in Babylon?
No king.
There's no king. And one of the very important innovations, which is important to the present day, was introduced by Ezra and Nehemiah together, but particularly Nehemiah was the person behind this. Now, to keep the temple going, to be able to offer these sacrifices every morning, every evening, cost a lot of money. Now, who provides this in the post-exilic period? The people make a covenant with themselves before God that all the congregation promises to finance this. So you get there you get the beginning of what we now call Christian stewardship. Now, to the present day, who provides for the running of the congregation? The congregation. Who provided for the running of the congregation? The temple in the post-exilic period was the congregation. And if they didn't provide for it, then they were basically put themselves outside the congregation. Nathan, does that cover that? And that lasted all the way through to New Testament times. There was an addition that you need to know because it's historically very significant. As part of the deal that the Persians allowed the Jews to rebuild the temple was that the priests would offer a sacrifice for the Persian king and the royal family every day. And they paid for them to do that. Now, at the time of Jesus, the Romans picked that up, and part of the settlement between the Jews and the Romans, the Jews were exempted from paying certain taxes. They didn't have to pay homage to Caesar, worship Caesar. Instead of worshipping Caesar as Lord and God, what did they do?
Petition.
What? They not only made a petition for it, they presented offerings for Caesar and the Roman Empire every morning, every evening. Who financed that? The Roman government. Paid the priests to do that. Do you know what began the Great Revolt against Rome in 67 AD?
They stopped offering.
They stopped offering this sacrifice, and that was a de facto declaration of war on Rome. Right? Can you see the importance of this? Yes, Chris?
Said that the kings gave the lambs to be sacrificed.
Yes.
What happened during the period when the evil kings were in power and more interested in sacrificing to Baal or other gods?
Yes. Even, well, you can see there's two different things. What happens in the north is slightly different to the south.
Sure.
Okay, down the south, even the most evil kings never got rid of this, righto? Because it wasn't that they stopped doing this. They did it to the Lord, but they also did it to Asherah. Or they sacrificed to the Lord and they identified the Lord with Baal. But it's usually other additional stuff. So they offered sacrifices to God, but also to other gods. Right? So there's only one occasion under the reign of Ahaz where there was the daily burnt offering actually ceased. This is before Hezekiah, and Hezekiah then brings about a reformation, a cleaning out. Under Ahaz and the influence of the Assyrians actually, yes, Assyrians, there was pressure put on them to stop presenting the daily offering. And then instead you had offerings to the astrological Babylonian deities, the sun and the moon, stars and constellations. Yes, Michael?
Is that also in connection with the Romans paying the sacrifice in connection with paying for a papal mass.
Yep, it's a similar thing. Yep, very. I mean, a lot of this is carried over then for this, in medieval times, saying a mass for the dead, saying a mass for, you pay the priest to say a mass for you. It's a direct continuation of some of this stuff. Yes.
How would the priests have felt when the king, say, just wanted to put a statue in the temple, and when they started because there's that relationship between the your servants, but then you're under the king, but then at the same time they would have to know what they're doing.
There's so much that we don't know about the history of Israel, and that in particularly in negative stuff, very often is treated euphemistically. That's hinted at rather than described at detail because of how bad it is. So, for example, we know that Manasseh introduced a statue of Asherah, the Earth Mother, into the temple. We don't know where it was placed. It could have been placed next to the altar for burnt offering. Let me show you the temple roughly. Now that's the tabernacle, the temple later on. One theory is that the statue of Asherah was placed either before or the other side of the altar, or it could have been placed here in the holy place, but the majority opinion is that it was brought guess where? Holy of Holies, right next to the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. That's what made it so terrible. And according to both Kings and Chronicles, the reason why God merely delayed the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, despite the reformation of Josiah, remember the reformation of Josiah, who cleaned all this garbage out, was because his most holy place had been desecrated with the Asherah. Now, why would King Manasseh bring the Asherah into the Holy of Holies? He was a good modern person. He wanted to be inclusive. Male principle, female principle. God is neither, and the way he would have justified it is that we don't have two gods, but these are the two aspects of God. There's the male aspect, the throne aspect, and then there is the Asherah, which was a pole, a tree-shaped something, represents the female. All theologians can always find sophisticated explanations for atrocious actions. Now, we know that the people were horrified. However, there is one story that we hear about is hinted at Kings and is explained at some detail in Chronicles. You remember King Uzziah. Isaiah was called in the year that King Uzziah died. Now, the last part of Uzziah's reign, he disappeared from public view because he became a leper. And his son Jotham reigned as his regent. The whole latter part of his reign. And Isaiah was in fact a courtier working in the court of King Uzziah. And the year that King Uzziah died, he was called to serve the heavenly king. Now, he became a leper. There's an interesting story behind that. Uzziah decided that he needed to be more religious for political purposes. And his argument was, seems to be, all God's people are holy, therefore all God's people are priests, therefore I am a priest, therefore what? Therefore I can go on the altar and I can enter this place to burn incense. Now, he arranged it in such a way that the first part he managed to do, because he, we don't know, he must have influenced some priests. He appeared on one occasion, splashed the blood against the altar, and then instead of allowing the priest on duty to bring the coals and the incense here into the holy place, he went into the holy place. And according to the book of Chronicles, then the chief priests and the temple guard went in there and chucked him out of that place. And he was struck with leprosy. Now, God's judgment came on him for desecrating God's holiness because he, as one who was not authorized to do so, was standing in and acting as high priest. We know that's one occasion, but we know up in the north that one of the features of worship up in the north, remember, idolatry, was that the Jeroboam acted as high priest, and he would go on the altar and present the offering of the Lord as chief priest of the congregation. Yeah, so we get some stories, but there's lots of stuff like this. There's other bits and pieces that you get in Jewish tradition that hasn't been come down to us in the canonical scriptures. Yes?
So the temples in the north, designed and built to be almost exact copies of the...
Haven't a clue. Haven't a clue. And why is the Bible not interested in it? It's wrong.
It's wrong, yeah.
It's wrong, so you don't focus on that.
Yeah.
You just focus on it's an abomination, it's wrong, it's sinful. You focus on what's right rather than cursing what's wrong. There's a very important principle there. Don't curse what's wrong. Focus on promoting what's right. Now, what I'd like to do, because I don't want to carry this over to next period, is very quickly go through the personal family sacrifices. I think most of it is fairly straightforward. We won't be able to look at the passages, but you can look at it yourself. Personal family sacrifices. What people bring are the sacrifice of domestic animals, basically, as peace offerings. The peace offering is the sevach, either by itself, or it's called the sevach shelamim. Oh, where am I? Shalem has to do with peace. Shelamim is the offering, the animal offering of peace for things, which indicates that this has something to do with peace. Shalom, in the Hebrew sense. Shalom with God and shalom with each other. They were presented by the head of the family at the three great pilgrim feasts, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. And they were presented together with bread and oil and wine. The flour was made into bread, oil, wine. There were three classes of these kinds of shelamim, peace offerings. There was the thank offering. An offering in which you thank God for hearing your prayers, a votive offering, a vow made, and then thirdly, there's free will offerings that you offer just because. Now, the important thing is to see that these offerings were brought between the morning and evening sacrifice, in the middle of the day, around about noon, and they would be placed on the morning sacrifice, and they would be covered by the evening sacrifice. Can you see? In this way, they were incorporated into the daily sacrifice. Now, let's say you presented a lamb or sheep as a peace offering. The blood from that would be, you'd kill the animal, you'd prepare the animal, and then you'd present the blood of the animal to the priest on duty who was representing you. He would splash it against the side of the altar in the rite of atonement. And then secondly, the priest on duty would take the liver, and most importantly the liver lobe, the lobe of the liver, together with the kidneys and the fat of the animal. Now you need to know that all this stuff was used for divination in pagan people. So this was offered to God to prevent the use of sacrificed animals for divination. So God, there's only a very little part of the animal that's offered to God. The liver because that was used in divination, the kidneys because it was used for divination, and the fat, which was the best part of it. All the technical term for those three things are the fatty pieces, the fatty parts of the sacrifices, or the fat of the sacrifices. Now, the forequarter of the animal, together with a little bit of the bread, would be offered to the priest on duty, who could take it home and use it in the family meals. He didn't have to eat it at the temple. He could take it back home. Whereas the other offerings had to be eaten at the temple. This he could take home for his family. He took forequarter of the animal, some of the flour, olive oil, wine back home for family meals. Now, the rest of the offerings, the rest of the olive oil, flour, wine, and all the rest of the meat of the animal was eaten then in the holy meal in God's presence. So there's a holy meal both for the priests and their families as well as the people and their families. And it consists of all the good stuff, not just bread with olive oil, but meat and wine as well. A festive meal. So because part of it had been presented on the altar, the rest of it was holy, and you therefore ate holy bread, drank holy wine, ate holy meat as God's guests from the table of God. Now, any layperson could, in addition to this, offer three other kinds of sacrifices. You could present a cereal offering, or an animal offering, or both of them together. But as an act of devotion, he could, or she could, or the family could present a burnt offering, which the whole animal was burnt. It wasn't required, that's a free will offering. It's never required of lay people, it's only required for the public sacrifices. Secondly, if a person commits a sin, breaks one of the 10 Commandments, and then repents of the sin, and this is the second table of the 10 Commandments, so that it is no longer a deliberate sin against God. Now, unintentional is the opposite to deliberate sin. You don't intend to sin against God. You don't do it in defiance of God. You're sorry for it. You want forgiveness. You bring a sin offering, and you receive then forgiveness and cleansing from your sin before you present your other offerings. Can you see? So this is like a rite of private confession and absolution for the Israelites. If you broke one of the first 3 commandments and desecrated something holy, you had to bring a guilt offering.
Yeah, okay.
So if you desecrated something holy, you had to bring a guilt offering. And as well as an animal, you had to pay compensation for damages done to God for what you've stolen from God, something holy. So guilt offerings have to do with desecration, sin offerings have to do with immoral deeds. I think I've covered that there. Oh, just one last thing. For both sin offerings and guilt offerings, only the fatty parts were burnt on the altar. The rest of the whole animal was given to the priests. And it was most holy, which meant that it had to be eaten within the temple precincts. So every day, the priests would eat 3 kinds of most holy food. They would eat the bread from the most holy offering. They would eat meat from the sin offerings and guilt offerings. And you'll find references to that in the prophets who say that priests are greedy for the sins of the people. Can you work out what's going on? What? What's the prophet getting at?
Sin more, you get to eat.
Sin more. The more the people sin, the more meat there is to eat. So the priests on duty would have a very high meat diet, because all the meat from the sin offerings and guilt offerings would be divvied up among the priests on duty, and you could only eat it there. You couldn't take it home. You could take the meat from the peace offering back home. You could take the bread or the flour and olive oil and wine from the people's offerings, the ordinary cereal offerings. You could take that back home for your family and eat it there, provided you were in a state of ritual purity. But that meat, that most holy meat, had to be eaten there at the temple, which meant that some days you had meat coming out of your ears.